I'm Dorothy Hanson, and I was born August 19, 1929. My parents, on my mother's side, were German descent, and my dad was born in America, and his grandfather was born in Kentucky. So he always considered himself an American. But we've traced it down to like France and Germany. As far as my grandparents, I did not know any of my grandparents except one grandfather, and that was on my father's side. And my grandpa would come and stay with my folks on the farm and try to help out on the farm too. But that was the only grandparent that I knew. My childhood, I figure I came from a good childhood. My mother and dad, we always went to church, and there were 6 of us, it seemed like we all had to go whenever they went, but we went. But we had neighbors from the farm, different, that would come and play cards and this sort of thing, and then us kids would play kick the can or different things, and Annie I over, and that's ball going over the roof of the house or something, and you had to catch it, and we had a good time. And that was often because everybody was more or less, the farm neighborhood were all in the same situation, and so that was their social life. And my mother always worked on the farm. She never worked anyplace else. But and my dad, we always had hired men, and mother sometimes would have a hired girl, especially when she was pregnant and having a baby. Why, she would have help. And we got to be quite close to every one of them. And we had hired men all the time. So mother had to cook for like 8 people every day. And so that kept her busy. And my father raised chickens, he raised cattle, pigs, and we had lots of chickens. And he would sell the eggs to a bakery in Sioux Falls. And by selling them, we would put it in a large container, and the yolks would be broken and this sort of thing, and they were frozen, and that's when how the bakery would accept them. My folks seemed to be always doing something, and my dad was in director like of an elevator, and sometimes so they were very active in the community. My dad also bought a thrash machine, and when it was harvest time, he would go to the neighbors and do the harvesting for them. And then at the end of the summer, we'd have a big party. And it was always around my birthday that we had that. I can remember. And then I went to high school, and in high school there were no buses, of course. We had to find our way to the high school, which was 4 miles into Inwood, Iowa. And the students that were old enough to have cars, we pooled and got picked up on the rides, and it might be someone different some days, but that's how we got to school. And I went there for 1946 is when I graduated. And at that time I was only 16 years old, And so I was the youngest child in the class. And I always had competition with my girlfriend for grades. And she became the valedictorian, and I got to be salutatorian, but by 0.5%. So that's the way that was, but that was fine. Well, the hardship that I had was I was born cross-eyed, and I cried lots of days because I wanted to have that fixed. People could not see who I was looking at half the time when I would talk to them. And so my parents checked out where to go at that time. It was either Marshalltown, Iowa, or Rochester, Minnesota that would do that. And so they decided to take me to Rochester, Minnesota. And my doctor was Dr. Prangen, who was Helen Keller's doctor. And I had to do that they wouldn't do both eyes at the same time. So I had to do it 1 year and then the next year for surgery. And so that helped my ego and image by being able to see straight. But at the time I developed to study instead of having boyfriends, and that was just one of the things that worked out, I guess. And I'm happy that we were able to do that. It made life a lot easier. After I graduated from high school, I decided to go to college and they had a secretarial course at the Sioux Falls College in South Dakota. And so I decided to go there, and that was a 1-year course. And I could have gone 4 years. My dad would have paid for 4 years of college, but I thought that was enough. But to this day, I was sorry that I didn't go further. But anyway, I got a job right away as a secretary at Central Telephone Company. And I worked there for 2 years. Then my girlfriend from college, we decided we wanted to be adventurous, and we decided to go to California. I had an uncle that lived in Los Angeles, and she had an aunt that lived in California there. And so we decided to stay with them until we got a job. It took quite a while for us to find a job, and we were young, of course, but at that time when I went to apply for jobs, I could walk the streets of Los Angeles and not be afraid to go by myself. And then I did get a job at a consolidated steel company, and I was in a steno pool, which I did not really like because you had to work for many different people. And then I decided, my girlfriend that I went with, she couldn't find a job, so she had to go back to a teaching job. And she ended up out in the desert, so our plans to live together just didn't materialize. And so then after working there in California for 2 years, I decided to go back to Inwood, to my parents' home. And I did that. But of course I needed to get another job. And so the best place to go was Sioux Falls, South Dakota. That was the biggest city around. And I started working for the Northern States Power Company. I had in the sales department as a secretary. And after a while, I saw this cute guy going down the hallways, and he'd always go past my door. And I decided to find out who he was. And his name was Sid Hanson, and he worked in the trouble department there in Northern States. And he was quite new there too. And here he used to live in Canton, South Dakota, which was only 10 miles from where my folks lived. So on weekends when I wanted to go home, why, he'd give me a ride. And he had quite a nice new Chevy with leopard seats, and I thought, boy, that's cool. But anyway, we got along good. And then he asked me for a date, and we went to Sioux City, Iowa, to a race car race. And then after that, why, it was history. He proposed in a few months, and we got married March 24th, 1951. But that year, we had lots of snow. And in February, I think it snowed every weekend. And some weekends I couldn't get home to help plan the wedding. But then they scheduled a shower for me one weekend, and it wasn't possible to get there. So they canceled it for the other weekend. And that weekend it snowed too. But my dad says, I'm going to get you there to the shower. But it was planned to be on a farm place, and they decided to have it in town at my aunt's place because maybe more people would get there. Well, there were 3 neighbors that came in a wagon drawn by horses to the farm where we lived. And then my dad he says, I'll take you. And we all piled in his car. And if I didn't have this journalized, I wouldn't believe it. But 11 of us piled in that car. I think there probably were 4 in the front and 4 in the back and some sitting on the laps. I don't know. But we got there safe and sound. And I loved my dad for that, but it was good. And then when we got married, it was the roads were terrible. One way a lot of times on the highway. And we had to have flags on our car antennas in order to see a car was coming. Anyway, but my parents gave us a nice wedding. We had a wedding, and our wedding was in the Church of Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Inwood, and then a nice reception dinner in their hall. His folks came from Norway, and his mother came over on a boat when she was 20 years old to come to America. And she was a family of 11 children, but she decided to come to America. That took a lot of adventure to go by herself. And Sid's father, he took a boat and he jumped ship and got to America that way. Sid's mother, she had a ticket of $80 for the trip to America, and someone sponsored her and paid for it. And then when she got to the United States, she had to pay that off. And it took her a year and 3 months to pay that off because she got a job for $10 a month. But the $10, she did housework. She landed in Canton, South Dakota, and that is where she met George Hanson. Sid had 3 siblings. There were 4 children in the family. when we got married, we rented a apartment that was brand new, hadn't never been used before, and it was like a one-bedroom, but the bed came out of the wall and into the kitchen. We said we could warm our feet up in the oven if we wanted to, or put our other foot in the refrigerator. But it was, we furnished it, and we liked it. And then we also rented another house. Now, we were both working for Northern States Power at that time. And so we rented a house that was a little house behind a big house. And that was an older house, but we lived there for a year, I think. I got pregnant, and so we decided we should buy a house. And we checked things out, and we found a house that was near the college in Sioux Falls, and it was Augustana College, and so we had a story and a half, and we moved. Well, I think it was about a month before I was due for when I was pregnant, but then we also rented the upstairs bedrooms to college kids, and we rented it for $4 a week. And then after a couple of years, we had a boy on March 28th, 1953, and Stephen was our first son. And then I couldn't work after 7 months of pregnancy. You had to quit work. And so I did that, and I never went back to work until my children were all in school. And I was fortunate that I could stay home. And Sid was at Northern States as a troubleman, and where he worked shift work. He would have to work like 7 to 4 or 4 to 11, rotate. So there was times when we were alone at night, and Jane was born in May 4th, 1955, and at that time, we were still living in our house there, and we paid $12,000 for that house. They asked for $15,000, and I said, well, we can't do that. We'll do it for $12,000, and they accepted. So, but our third child was born on February 13th, 1958, and her name is Jill Ann. When Jill was in kindergarten, I decided to go to work again. And I applied at the YMCA, and they hired me. But I just worked part-time, and there were 2 of us that filled a full-time job. So, and then eventually that was all secretarial work. I was able to do part-time for quite a while. In 1964, I think I went full-time. I started in the bookkeeping department, and I liked the bookkeeping part, and so I decided, I worked for a gal that was 80 years old, and so it was really time for her to quit, and so then I got to be the bookkeeper. And I worked at the YMCA for 25 years, and I loved my job. And that was time when computers were just starting up, our first computer at the Y, and I had the responsibility of putting all the data in the computer and making accounts and this sort of thing. That was hard work, but we made it, and people helped me, so that was good. And that's probably why I got into the computer technology. Steve was quite an artist even when he was young, and in high school, why he drew a picture of Herbert Hoover, and it got to be on TV show, and I think he was honored with some courses too, for art courses. And then high school, why he would draw for quite a few people, and I think he even drew pictures for the teachers sometimes for grades. but he liked it, and he decided he wanted to do that for his career. And we always thought that he should go to a school that had graphic arts instead of like paintings and this sort of thing. But he chose to go to school in Minneapolis, School of the Arts. And he graduated from that school. When Steve graduated from the School of the Arts, why his high school sweetheart, Pam Bronson, decided to come to Minnesota too. And they decided to get married, and that is when my grandson, my only grandson, was born, and Zachariah was his name. And Jane, our second child, she was our child that had a sense of humor like her dad, and she was always very active. And in high school, why she imitated Lily Tomlin, with the gal sat in a big high chair and told jokes, and she would present programs at the high school on that. But she liked to do that, and she was always very energetic, very energetic. She went to school in Aberdeen, South Dakota, which is a state school, and she was taking physical education. And when she graduated, why, she got a job in Mitchell, South Dakota. And there is when she met Dan Giles, and they got married, and they had a daughter named Jennifer Stephanie. She was always a loving child. And then Jane had another child 10 years later, and her name was Catherine. And they were living in North Carolina at that time. Dan had a job for Northern Telephone Company, and they moved about every 6 months installing telephone equipment. So they moved a lot. And the first time we went to see them, Jennifer was 1 year old. And when we came in, she took her first steps. And we always remembered that too. But Catherine was 10 years later, so that was like a new family. And she was a good baby, but we took care of her when she was 3 years old, because Jane was diagnosed with cancer. And we came here, and they were living in North Carolina at that time. Dan had gotten a job at a research center, and they were living in North Carolina. So we came down there. This was after we were retired, and we rented an apartment for 6 months at a time, and the kids would furnish the apartment, and then we would try to help the family while she was sick. And she had a bone marrow transplant, which you had to have a caregiver with her all the time at that time. And so her good friend, when she was in grade school and high school and all the way, she says, I'll do that. And you had to be at least 6 weeks to do that. And she was able to do it for 1 month, and then someone else had to take over. And then Dan was the one that was there with her. But they said they were going to give her 5 years, but they gave her 1. After Jane had her bone marrow, she got to go home, and she more or less was in hospice. And my birthday was August 19th, and she left a birthday card. She was very sick at that time, and she left a birthday card thanking me for what we had done. And then August 22nd of 1997, she died. And she even talked to a friend that also had cancer, and she said, I'll see you in heaven. And they were very outgoing about their cancer and their sickness. So, but that was sad, and we miss her very much. But I think she's better off where she's at now. She isn't suffering. And then our third child, Jill Hanson, she was more quiet than Jane, and but she was our smart one too, though. She went to Black Hills College, and she studied airline stewardess. She was going to be an airline stewardess, but she never did get a job of airline stewardess. She met this fellow from North Carolina, and they came back to Sioux Falls. She went 2 years of college, and then about a couple of years later, they decided they wanted to move to North Carolina. So, but they got married, and they moved to North Carolina, and that's where Jill has been all her life. She applied for a job at Haynes Brands, which is, it was known more or less as underwear place. But anyway, she applied for a job, and she worked there for 39 years. So, and she ended up being a calling center manager. And she liked riding her bicycle around town, and seems like that's what has happened when she married Jeff McNeil. He was a bicyclist, and that's how they met each other, and that has been a good hobby for both of them. After we retired in 1989, we both retired at the same day. Sid says, if I retire, you're retiring. And I was only 60 years old, but that was okay. So that's when we bought a houseboat with our friends, and we parked it at the Lewis and Clark Arena in Yankton, South Dakota. And we had some good times on our houseboat. Then we as we were riding on the lake, we saw a house for sale. And it wasn't a house, it was a double wide. But think we could find it. After we got on ground, we couldn't find it. And when we finally went, we had to go to the campgrounds in order to get there. This was even before we were retired that we bought this property. And so we spent many weekends there. And then when we retired, we decided to sell our double wide and build a home there. And we did that in 1990 while we moved from Sioux Falls to Yankton and at the lake. And we lived there for 10 years. And then we went back to Sioux Falls and bought a condo, which was Sid's sisters lived there. And we said whenever she was ready to sell her condo, we would probably like to have it. And that's what happened when she had to go into a home, nursing home. And those were good days. Our retirement we really enjoyed because we traveled a lot, and we traveled all over the United States. I think went every state except Rhode Island. I can't remember that we ever went to Rhode Island. And then also we went on tours through our church to Ireland, to Spain and Portugal. We followed the footsteps of Paul in Greece and Turkey. And we just had a good time. I mean, and we were fortunate we could afford to do that. And so our retirement years were very happy until Sid got sick. And we spent also in the wintertime for 11 years in Arizona. And we would go down there in January and come back in the 1st of April. And we always rented, most of the time, a double wides. And we celebrated our 50th anniversary there and had family there. And we did a karaoke entertainment. Everybody sang, every table sang a song. And that was a good time too. We were married for 59 years. When Sid got sick, he had heart problems, but he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and so he was diagnosed in May, and Sid died in September 26, 2010. I miss him dearly, and after 4 years of living in Sioux Falls, after he died, I decided I should move to North Carolina and to be with my daughter Jill. And then I had 2 granddaughters that were of Jane's, and one lives in Charlotte and one lives in Asheville, North Carolina, which are both a distance away, but I can see them now. And Jennifer has so I have a great-grandchild, and she is Liza Jane. And I'm very fortunate that I can be here. And at first, when I first came to North Carolina to stay, I decided I did not want to go into a retirement place. So I rented an apartment, and I did that in 2014. So I did that for 7 years before I moved into a retirement independent living. And I moved here in September 30th, 2021, and I've met many friends, and I feel this is the place I should be. After retirement and all, and I am now 92 years old, I figure I've been blessed with a good life. Physically, I am well, except I have arthritis in my legs, and I can't walk as well as I want to, but I still really feel blessed that I can do the things I want to do. After moving here in North Carolina, in 2020, we had a pandemic, and that has lasted nearly 3 years, which is an experience nobody else has gone through, and I guess the last pandemic was 100 years ago. So it's been pretty much experimental as far as how to take care of vaccinations and how to take care of yourself. And so many people had to be more or less staying at home and even working at home, which has made the working industry very different in these days, because many people will probably remain working at home. And this might be good, and we don't know, but that's the change that has been made in the whole world. And with the faith of God, He has led me to different places that I wouldn't have been able to do without Him. I feel that He is my guide, and He is with me always, and every day. And I really don't think I could have done without Him for going through some of the things we had to do, especially with Jane's death and this sort of thing. But I really think that I lived in the good old days, and at this point, we don't know what's ahead of us, but we hope that they will be good too.